Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining this first session of 2021. We sort of begin tonight, unfortunately, with some sad news. I'm wearing a particular T-shirt in Mr. Tiano's honour this evening. Unfortunately, yesterday evening, Frank Tiano, the promoter, and the brains behind Top Gun, Florida Jets, passed away. He's quite a remarkable character. I mean, Dad and I sort of followed Top Gun from when it began, and I never for one moment thought that I would have the privilege, of attending the event, never mind being a judge. Frank's, my very first email with Frank, I must admit, I sort of reached with some sort of trepidation. He is quite a character. However, he does have, he didn't like to hear it said, but like a real soft side. You can see that with the picture there with young Cody Haig on the right-hand side. He absolutely loved seeing kids being involved in aeromodeling. He would send little packages to people who were maybe like in rougher times of his Zap glues, which he distributed. Just a real larger-than-life character who was full of enthusiasm for the hobby. His favourite aircraft down in the corner there was the P-47, which he said that I could never say properly. He said if I was coming to the US to judge it, I had to say it properly. And then his good friend Eduardo Estevez, that owned the PT-19 down in the corner, he immortalised them by having Frank in the cockpit. His wife Carol was always there by his side, and Carol actually posted something earlier, which I think a lot of aeromodelers will attest to. So I'll quote from Carol. And it says, the first date I ever had with Frank, he told me he had a hobby that he would never give up for anyone. I'm so glad that he had this passion for the hobby and aviation. We've met so many wonderful people and formed such great friendships because of the hobby. And I think any of us who were involved with Top Gun or Frank in any way can actually say the same. He brought so many people together. We had fantastic experiences. A lot of the guys that are on here tonight, who I now class as very good friends in the US, then that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Frank. And then to use the quote that he's got in the cap that he sent around a few people in the centre there, it was sort of make model airplanes great again. Mike Barbie, do you want to say a few words just before add anything? You've been a long-term friend, if you want to unmute yourself.
There yeah, I've known Frank for about 32 years now, and we kind of go back. He could be caustic at times, but he had a heart of gold. He really did. There wasn't an event that I put on that he didn't support, that he didn't send some zap or some kind words or something like that. And it was I was really happy that he was inducted into the AMA Scale Hall of Fame 2 years ago, and I was present. He was not present at the induction ceremony, but he was very happy. And if you get a chance and you go to the AMA site here in the States, you can read a very nice biography. His biography is very tells very much about the man and his passion for the hobby. We go back quite a ways. As you know, Frank would get a little bit stressed at some of the events at the start, so he would call me, and I would be his designated driver, so he could go out and unwind on an evening before or during the contest. So we go back pretty far, and my wife Barb they were very, very good friends. So he will be missed, and thank you very much for this little get together that we could. And soon there will be a Balsa USA will be putting on a tutorial about Frank's life. So look for that coming up on YouTube. So thank you, Graham. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So just if we can all have a few quiet moments in respect of Frank.
Very good.
Okay, thank you for that. On to tonight's festivities, you could say. As is normally the case, we'll hand over to the presenter for this evening, Andy Sephton, who will take you through his slides, photos, etc. And then we'll leave questions to the end, Andy, as normal. So if you want to raise your hand in the participant window or type it in the chat, if you don't have audio, then when we get to the end, we'll unmute and allow you to ask your questions. So over to Andy.
I put up those two pictures. The top right, the Harrier, is my favorite jet. The one bottom that has provided quite a lot of what's the right word? It's been very useful to me. It's an ABC Robin. It's a model that I built in 1987-88. It won the British Nationals in 88 and 91. But one of my retirement goals was to learn how to paint. And I was very fortunate in having a very good teacher, a lady by the name of Jean Picton. She's in her 80s. She was a windmill dancer in the 40s and 50s, worked at Raymond's Review Bar, which English people would know about, ended up as a TV personality, took up art at the age of 60, did a degree, set up an art school out in Spain, came back, moved to Sandy around her 80th birthday and set up an art school in Sandy, which is my hometown. She taught me to paint, and I used this picture as a basis for a painting of the Robin, which was accepted by the Guild of Aviation Artists for their annual exhibition. So it proved a very, very useful model. I'd just like to say a few words about the building behind it. This picture was taken at Farnborough back in 1988. I was stationed there as a test pilot. It's the nuclear hangar where they used to store the nuclear nuclear-armed aeroplanes back in the 60s. It was disused at the time and has since been demolished, and it now forms a basis for the British aerospace area at the southeast corner of Farnborough Airfield. But in those days, it was an empty hangar, and I needed somewhere to test the model. So I was told about it by one of my engineers. It's a hangar that sits in the middle of some woods, so not many people knew about it. And I spent a number of evenings in the hangar flying the model. There's one occasion, though, when I was there with my then girlfriend. We heard the most horrendous noise coming from the far end of the hangar. Now, it was very quiet, very cold inside. Quite a ghostly experience. And I turned to my girlfriend and I said, "What on earth was that?" And she said, "Oh, it's the wind." And I said, "There's no wind." And we looked at each other, went white as a sheet, ran out the building, and I never went back. I'm not afraid of ghosts, but in this particular case, I could make an exception, you know. So a couple of weeks later, the ground crew guy, the engineer, who was asked me how I got on with the model in the hangar, and I said it was fine. I said, but we had this funny experience, and he said, oh, there's a couple of ghosts in there. There's a guy that got stuck in the roof and died and wasn't spotted for a few days, and another chap that was overcome by fumes while he was servicing a fuel tank and died in there, and their ghosts run abroad. So yeah, okay, that's fine. To this day, I don't know whether the story was true, whether he was setting me up, and whether he was, whoever it was, making that ghostly noise, or whether there's a fact a ghost in that hangar. So there we go. That's the story of the ABC Robin. Let's go ahead. This is a scenario. I was wondering really what to talk about. I've been a modeler all of my life. The model stuff's on the left-hand side. But I've also been a professional pilot for all of my professional life, which is on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go through all of that because it would take far too long, but it's there on the screen. Let's carry on. What I'm going to do is go down the right-hand side, and if there's anything pertinent that meets up with what's on the left, then we'll talk about it. So my first flight, this was in 1958. I'm in the front seat. I was badgering my father to allow me to go flying. My sister had been given horse riding lessons, and I felt it was rather unfair that she could get horse riding lessons when she was very fond of horses, and I wasn't getting flying lessons, which at the age of 8, you can understand wasn't really a good thing. So reluctantly, he paid for a flight in the Armstrong Whitworth Company Tiger Moth. I went into the front seat, and because the Sutton harness wouldn't fit, the smallest or the tightest setting on the harness was still too loose. So one of the club pilots got in the front. I sat on his lap. They did up the harness around us, and the 3 of us got airborne in this Tiger. They said, we'll give you a circuit, and if you like it, we'll do another one. I said, no, just get up and go. But they insisted. We did a circuit, landed. I said, I want another one. So we did another one, and that was it. That was my first time airborne. A few years later, with the Air Training Corps, I was fortunate enough to get a Royal Air Force Flying Scholarship, which paid for 30 hours of flying in a Cessna 150. That was the aircraft I went solo in, a 150A, Romeo Sierra Bravo, with the Cumberland Westmoreland Aero Club at Carlisle. We were there in August, but for the whole of the month there, it rained and rained and rained. And as you can see, there's big puddles on the ground. At the age of 17, then I gained my PPL. I didn't get my driving test until 2 years later, when I was 19. Most of my money that I earned from a Saturday job went on either model airplanes or buying flying time in the local flying club. So there's nothing else for driving. And it wasn't until I started full-time work when I was 19 that I could afford to do driving lessons. So there we go. What it meant was that I used to cycle up to the airfield and then fly the aeroplane, take my friends in the aeroplane, and then cycle back home again. Joined the Air Force in 1969 and started flying Chipmunks. This was taken at a summer camp in Thorney Island in 1970. I'm trying to look nonchalant and not really achieving it very well, but that's me standing in front of the aeroplane. I'm going to say a couple of words about the models now. I started building models in 1958 with a Keelcraft Spitfire. My father was a toolmaker. He was very pedantic about getting things absolutely right. And I completed the model, covered it without sanding it, so the trailing edge was rectangular shaped. And he made me strip off the model, sand it down and recover it. I didn't have enough tissue, and I was getting very frustrated as to how long it was taking me. So I figured that if a Blériot could fly without tissue on a fuselage, then so should a Spit. So I covered the wings, flew the model, and that was my first foray into aeromodeling. I decided to be serious about it when I was 13, 1963, and ran through most of the Keelcraft kits. The best duration I ever got out of the small scale models was probably 2 or 3 seconds, but I had a lot of fun building them. My first successful model was Caprice, which was a towline glider, a Keelcraft kit, 50-inch wingspan, which I had, I think, for my 14th Christmas present, and flew it successfully for the following year in Coventry's Memorial Park. The next successful model was a Blackburn Monoplane, which gave me a love for that aeroplane that has lasted to the present day. I never once figured in those days of the 60s flying the model that I'd ever end up flying the full-size aeroplane, but a little bit more on that later. Another aircraft that I'd like to talk about is the Bristol Monoplane. I'll explain more later, but I built a Bristol Monoplane, a free flight scale model, in 1967. It didn't last very long, but just store that fact away for the moment. Right. After 3 years at university doing a physics degree, that becomes important later, so we'll store that fact away as well. I moved over to Cranwell. This is a picture taken of the Jet Provost from the ground school window. We did 12 weeks of officer training, which as far as I was concerned was purgatory, and if there wasn't flying at the end of it, I would have left immediately. It's a little bit like an officer and a gentleman. Not as bad as that, but that really is what officer training is like, or it was in those days. Ran through Cranwell on the Jet Provost, but it wasn't just the flying at Cranwell. We also ended up having to march. I'm the chap on the right holding a sword, as my good friends Ian Pallister on the extreme left, Jim Arkle in the middle, both of whom I'm still in touch with. Ian and Jim ended up on Harriers, and Dick McMillan at the back unfortunately failed flying training and ended up as an education officer. Also with the marching came in shooting, and shooting comes important later in the game. This was the Cranwell team in 73 and the Cranwell team in 74. After Cranwell, we go to Valley, which is on Anglesey, where we start flying proper fast jet airplanes. And I put this up because there's a chap in the middle at the front, third from the left on the front row is a chap called Bob Marston, which he comes in later in the chat. I'm extreme right in the middle row. I'm the one with the dark hair. This was the Nat. We did about 70 hours on that for advanced training. My claim to fame on the Nat, in fact, is that my final handling test was carried out by a chap called Hugh Rigg, who was Diana Rigg's brother. He was an RAF fighter pilot and test pilot, one of the few pilots ever to have landed a Harrier successfully engine off. Quite a named chap within the flying community, although people would really know his sister a lot better. And I had the privilege of meeting his sister some years later when I had a coffee with her at Old Warden, which was rather nice. Following the Nat, we converted onto the Hunter. This is in training colours. This is also at Valley, before we then went on to the Tactical Weapons Unit of Brawdy, which is in South Wales. I don't have any pictures of Brawdy because I've lost a lot of pictures of that era. We then moved to Lossiemouth for the operational conversion on the Jaguar. Now, when we went through Nats, none of us knew where we were going to end up, and we were given 4 choices. My first choice was to go on to Buccaneers. My second choice was to go on to Phantoms. My third choice was to go on to the Hunter. And my fourth choice, I put anything but Jaguar. So I'll give you one guess as to where the Air Force sent me. So having completed the Jaguar at OCU, I fetched up on 54 Squadron. This is a view of the aircraft from the control tower at Coldershore. You'll notice that on the front of the aeroplane, It has a lion rampant with fleur-de-lis. That's important in a couple of minutes' time. Within a couple of months of joining the squadron, we had Princess Margaret visit, and the caption here says 16 ship -4. It was a 16 ship formation that we flew for Princess Margaret, but unfortunately 4 aircraft went US. I'm in the front 4 on the left-hand side as you're looking at it, so I'm slightly out of position when you compare it to the guy on the right. In fact, the guy on the left is in the right position. It's the guy on the right that's out. I'm glad you're smiling at that one. One slightly funny thing that occurred with Princess Margaret was we had the aircraft. I'm just going to go back. We had the aircraft lined up like that. We'd got 12 aeroplanes and 14 pilots. So 12 of us had to stand in front of the aircraft dressed up in flying suit with squadron badge, name badge, squadron scarf, and our Jaguar patches. The name badges were new in. A lot of the older pilots couldn't be bothered with them, so refused to buy them. But I was a new chap on the block, so I bought a set of badges for myself. It was insisted that we had to look the same when we went on the line, lying in front of the airplanes for the Princess. So we very quickly sewed some of my badges on the other pilots. And I have to say, neither the station commander nor Princess Margaret noticed that there was 3 Andy Sephtons on the squadron that morning. So I took a shooting team to Bisley in 1977. We had a lot of success with SLR, which is what we're holding there. 9mm pistol, submachine gun, and target rifle. So much so that I got enough prize money to buy myself a good quality mandolin, which I still have. I played a mandolin for about 50 years. There was a sad side to it in that I got picked to shoot for the Royal Air Force, but my then flight commander wouldn't give me the time off. So that became a bit of a bone of contention, but we had a good week. It was also the subject of the most embarrassing moment of my life when I was lined up on a firing point of 150 of us with submachine guns. And we were given the command to step forward, take up our weapons, take up our magazines, load our magazines and cock our weapons. And unfortunately, I didn't pull the slide back far enough. So it wasn't on the sear. I let go of the slide and the round fired. There was 150 pairs of eyes looked inwards. The range officer got on the megaphone and said, "Who was that?" And I had to say, "Me, Sergeant." He said, "Come here." And you know how it feels. It's the beam me up Scotty moment, but unfortunately we couldn't do that. So I marched up to the range officer, saluted him. He looked me up and down very tersely, burst into a grin, and he said, "You're not going to do that again, are you?" I said, "Not at all." And that was the end of that, which is one of the nice bits of man management that I've had to suffer. There have been worse. This is a candid photograph taken by a colleague at roughly the same time. I put that up because the idea, the common idea of the frontline RAF fighter pilot is, I have got blue eyes, but blue eyes, clean shaven, nicely, cleanly turned out, smartly turned out, cup of coffee there, all looking nice and honkadory. The reality, though, is something like this. This is what it looks like when we're working. This is exercise in Tearstrup. We lived in tents. It's in the winter. We're in fields of mud. We washed in tents. We ate in tents. We got covered in mud. We got no sleep. We were flying dawn and dust strikes, and it was horrible. The standard phrase really was, "None of this was in the adverts when we joined." But that, I have to say, is the reality of a modern day fighter pilot. Not recommended. So after the Jaguar, we a little bit more on 54 Squadron. I was very fortunate in that in the first year that I was on the squadron had its 60th anniversary. Squadron was formed in 1916 in France by Major K.K. Horn and his adjutant, Captain Charlie, on the Sopwith Pup. At the dinner, both KK Horn and Captain Charlie were guests of honor. They were both in their 90s, and they both, Captain Charlie gave a speech. He gave 3 anecdotes, but I can only remember one. And he said, and I quote, "Some of you have heard this before, forgive me for that, but I know some of you haven't." But Captain Charlie said, "In retrospect, it was a stupid thing to do." He said, "But in my defense, it was after a particularly drunken night in the mess, and I did win the bet. And I do believe I am the only person ever to fly a Sopwith pup stark naked over the Western Front." Also at the dinner were a lot of Second World War pilots, a lot of fighter pilots from the Battle of Britain, including Bill Hooper. Bill Hooper was the chap that invented Pilot Officer Prune, and he drew this menu for us, which is why I've put it on the screen. Also a chap called Pollock, who flew a Hunter underneath Tower Bridge. You've probably heard about what he did, but didn't know his name. And a number of other quite famous pilots were at that particular weekend. So it did impinge on my memory, should we say. Now, the following day, we were showing some people around the hangar, and it fell down to me to show a group of First World War ground crew around what was then a modern Jaguar fighter bomber. Most of the guys are in wheelchairs. There's about half a dozen of them. And as we were walking, I was walking, they were wheeling around the hangar with me. One of them took me by the arm and he said, "Hey, young man," he said, "how often do you crash your machines?" And I said, "Well, actually, not very often at all." He said, "Really? We used to crash ours every day." Which really sums up the difference between the First World War and modern times. This was the Sopwith pup, and again, I didn't realize that some 20, 30 years later, I'd be flying the aircraft that, or a similar aircraft to that flown by Captain Charlie, but there is no way I'm ever going to do it stark naked. Thank you very much. So I left 54 Squadron in the late 70s and moved over to RAF Brawdy, where we had the Tactical Weapons Unit. Model-wise, in '69, I went from free flight into single channel radio. I also dabbled in control line, and the characteristic of control line and single channel radio for me was that just about every model I built crashed on either the first or second flight. So I wasn't too enamored with it, but by 1976, I was in full-time work in the Royal Air Force, and I could afford a proportional gear. And I bought a Futaba 6M and a Keelcraft Super 60 kit and taught myself how to fly radio. That worked rather well and was going rather well. I'd got plans to build a Brian Taylor Spitfire and a Brian Taylor Mosquito when in the mid-80s I discovered scale indoors, but that comes a little bit later. So this is 1978, and I've been finished with the Jaguar and got posted to the Hawk at Brawdy. Very shortly after arriving at Brawdy, I ended up on the weapons instructor course. That's me on the extreme left. There was 2 of us on Hawk and 2 of us on Hunter. I mention that because the Tactical Weapons Unit at the time was in the process of converting from the Hunter to the Hawk. So they were still flying both types together. And the course was designed for the Hunter. So when we got all the notes for the weapons instructor course, they got Hunter crossed out at the top and Hawk written in its place. But the notes were exactly the same as the Hunters. They applied to the Hunter and not the Hawk. The Hunter's a 1950s aeroplane. The Hawk was a 1970s. So the way it was flown and the way we operated it and the way we operated the weapon system was quite different to that on the Hunter. So that was one of my biggest complaints when I completed the course and went back to the squadron to start teaching students. Some months later, I found myself back on the weapons instruction staff, and you can guess what my first job was. This is what it was all about. This is a smoke and flash practice bomb dropping on the range at Brawdy. This is Hunter just pulling off the target. A Hawk in a 10-degree dive onto the target. Not very spectacular, those two, but we've got something a little bit more spectacular later. And a couple of Hunters landing at Brawdy. I spent about a year rewriting the Hawk course in between teaching Hawk instructors how to do the weaponry. And at the end of that, it was quite successful, and I ended up with a Queen's Commendation, which was rather nice. At the end of the Brawdy course, or Brawdy tour, I was persuaded to go to France. It was not something I wanted to do, but I did want to be a test pilot. And I was told, effectively, if I'm going to do the test pilot course, then it has to be the French one. I didn't speak French, and I have to say, at the time, I didn't like the idea of going to France, and I didn't particularly like the French. But that changed. The Air Force taught me French. I went out there and I had the most marvelous 12 months of my RAF career. I don't have any pictures, unfortunately, of the aircraft that I flew, except for the Mirage F1 that I flew towards the end of the course. This is either myself or my colleague, and I can't remember which one of us it is in the airplane, but we both look the same. We've both got a white hat. We've both got a red flying suit. So it's not really, it doesn't really matter which one it was, and we'll talk about the pair of us in a moment. This is the F1 with the Mirage 3, which we also flew, but in this case, our engineer is in the back of the two-seat Mirage 3, and the instructor is in the front. The task that we had on the Mirage F1 was to assess the radar in the interception role. So we used the Mirage 3B as a target. Now, I'd been in France then for about 12 months. I'd been speaking French all the time. I'd been thinking French. I'd been flying in French. I'd been doing air traffic in French. And it was all going rather well. Air traffic international language is English, but locally the French speak French, which was working fine. In order to do this assessment, we needed PI radar, pilot intercept radar, and the radar controller, because they were working with foreign air forces, were speaking English. And as it turned out, they would control the target in French and the fighter in English. So we were speaking English in the cockpit. For me, because I was used to flying in French, I was in a French airplane with a French checklist and a French cockpit. I was thinking in French, and I'd been thinking in French for 12 months, and I'd lost the ability to think in English while I was in the air, which became rather bizarre because the instructions were given to me in English. I then had to translate them into French, process them, and then give it back in English. And it was coming out as absolute gibberish, which was a great source of amusement for all of my colleagues because the Englishman was the only person on the course who couldn't speak English in the air. There was another amusing incident with the F1. At the initial part of the assessment on the airplane, we had to take it supersonic. In the UK, if you're going supersonic, you go over the sea, air traffic point you out to sea, and then they clear you to accelerate so that you don't drop a boomer, as we call it, on anybody on land. Going supersonic over land can damage things. People don't like the noise, they don't like the damage. So I got airborne, took the Mirage up to about 50,000 feet, and then called for an acceleration. We flew south. We were working in the south of France, so flew south over the Mediterranean. Air traffic turned me about and put me on a northerly heading and said, "You're clear to accelerate." And I said, "But Marseille is on the nose." And he said, "Yeah, that's right. You're clear to accelerate." So I don't know what he had against Marseille, but they got a boomer off my Mirage F1 that day. Now, the other chap that flew it with me was a chap called Jacques Rossi. He ended up as chief test pilot of Airbus and did the first flights in the 380. This is his book. if you can understand French, it's quite interesting. If you can't, then it's not. But what surprised me was his biggest worry on the first test pilot was getting into work on the day, because of all the people that coming to see the 380 do its test would block off all the roads leading up to Toulouse Airfield. So he, excuse me just a sec. So he moved his bed into the office and slept in the office for a couple of days before the test flight, which I thought was quite interesting. So after doing the test pilot course in France, I came back to Boscombe Down. The job at Boscombe was carriage, release and jettison of weaponry various. This is a Sidewinder coming off a Hawk. You can't tell it from the picture, but I was doing 4G at the time. The cameraman was below me about 100 feet away, and there was another cameraman on my right-hand side, also about 100 feet away. We'd rolled into the firing quite quickly, and then quite quickly pulled up to 4G for the launch. So the two guys, a guy called Rod Fredrickson and can't remember the other one, did remarkably well to get those photographs. And the test was to make sure that the jet efflux didn't go down the intake of the airplane, which we'll go back to the first slide. You can see that quite clear that it's clear of the intake. So we then cleared the Hawk for Sidewinder, and that was the end of that. The rest of my time at Brawdy was spent, I converted to the Harrier, and we spent a lot of time dropping 540-pound bombs off the airplane, which you can see just there. We also dropped them off the Jaguar. We fired Sea Eagle missiles off the Buccaneer and also off the Sea Harrier, and did some work on the ski jump. So Boscombe Down proved to be quite an interesting area. There was one interesting part that for me was quite a plus, in that the weapons, the enemy aircraft flight over at Farnborough that had assessed enemy aircraft during World War II couldn't, that we'd got a couple of Picaras that we'd got at the end of the Falklands War, and they couldn't support flying them, so we had them at Boscombe Down. So one of my highlights of my tour at Boscombe, apart from the Sidewinder firings, of course, was doing an assessment in the Picara. And that's me in the front seat of the airplane, a chap called Russ Peart in the rear. Now, model-wise, at this time, a chap called Lindsay Smith, who you may or may not know, was working at Standards at Brawdy when I went there on the staff. We struck up a friendship, and he was organising scale indoors in the United Kingdom at the time. He'd set up a Royal Air Force competition, national competition at Uphaven, which is quite close to Boscombe, in 1985. Telephoned me, told me that was happening, and invited me along. I went to the competition and I was absolutely enthralled. That led to 20 years of scale indoor flying, a little bit of outdoors, but I gave up radio almost completely and didn't fly it for the following 20 years. I didn't get back into radio, in fact, until 2005. So after Brawdy came Farnborough. We had a P832 Chieftain that we used to carry the boffins around. That gave us quite a lot of CT flying, continuation training type flying for currency. But we also had a Buccaneer that we used for night vision system operation, a Harrier that we also did night vision work in. And I managed to convert to the Vixen. Now, I popped this photograph in. It was a photograph I took at Farnborough in 1964 with my father's camera. I'd only got 12 black and white shots. I don't know why I took this one of the three. Well, in fact, there's 4 Navy Vixens there. But the Vixen obviously took my fancy. And again, I had no idea at the time that some 20, 30 years later, I'd be flying the aeroplane. The Vixen operated out of Llanbedr. It was a drone aeroplane that they used for controller training. There was 2 aircraft. The chief pilot had flown it, but he left the company under a bit of a cloud, and nobody else flying there would fly the airplane. So we were asked to support it at Farnborough. I got the call saying, would you like to go to Llanbedr for 6 months? Llanbedr's in the middle of West Wales. So I said, absolutely not. And my boss said, would you like to fly Sea Vixen? So I said, when do I start? It was the first time in my career with the Air Force that I flew an airplane without being trained on it. I picked up the pilot's notes, read them, climbed into the airplane and flew it. And I have to say, there was really no issues. But there is one nice thing about being a full-size pilot and flying an airplane, in that you can get some rather nice documentation shots. So this was the side view that I posed for. That was the bottom view. And that was the top view. So I have to build a Vixen at some stage, if only to use the documentation. This is Foxy Lady. Both aircraft were sold off at the end of their RAF career. I flew this one once. I did most of my Vixen flying in the other airplane, which is that one. Foxy Lady is XP924. The aircraft I did most of my flying in is XS977, which is the upper aircraft, which has the red fins and the red nose. Foxy Lady, the one that went on to the civilian circuit in the UK, has got a yellow nose, yellow fins. There we go. Now, at this point, I left the Royal Air Force and started working for Rolls-Royce. I applied for several jobs. I was quite fortunate in that I missed a job in the United States flying the Osprey, because the test pilot that eventually got the job was killed in a crash. I missed a job working for British Aerospace because they'd cut down on pilots. But Rolls-Royce required a Harrier pilot. I was qualified on the airplane. I went down for an interview and saw a Spitfire sitting in the corner of the hangar. I asked them who flew it, and they said my predecessor did. And I asked them how many pilots flew it, and they said 2. And I asked them how many pilots they've got, and they said 10. So I thought, well, I'm 10th in line to fly the airplane. So I said, well, what's the chances of flying the Spit? And they said, you need to be tailward qualified. And I said, well, I'm flying Harvards with the Harvard team at the moment. They said, oh, that's all right. And I said, well, what about the other guys? And they said, well, they don't like flying it because it messes up their weekends. I said, oh, yeah, well, that's all right. I don't mind. And so I accepted the job. Not entirely for the Spitfire, because they'd also got a Harrier. But I have to say, it did colour my judgment. The first aircraft I converted to at Rolls-Royce was the Turbo Union 111, which was an aircraft we used to carry freight and passengers between UK, Germany, and Italy for the RB199 engine for the Tornado. Is that right? Yes. It then expanded to the EJ200 engine for the Eurofighter Typhoon, going out to Madrid as well. Over about 5 years, I got about 1,000 hours in this airplane, which is the only aircraft I've ever got 1,000 hours on, funnily enough. But the real reason the company employed me was to fly this beastie. It was an upgraded Pegasus for the United States Marine Corps. It gave an extra £1,000 of thrust in VSTOL flight in high temperatures and an extra £3,000 in cooler temperatures. The main reason, though, that the Marine Corps wanted the airplane was that it was flat rated up to a much higher temperature. Jet engines lose thrust as temperature increases. The older engine in the Harrier 2, GR5 as it is here, the 1121 engine, was flat rated up to about 15 degrees centigrade and then lost about 100 pounds of thrust per degree centigrade above that. The 1161 that we were testing here at Filton in '89 was flat rated up to about 28 degrees, which made a significant difference if they were bringing weapons back on the ship in hot climes. Prior to this engine, they would have to jettison the weapons before they could do a vertical landing on the ship, and a lot of the weapons they had were very expensive. And so upgrading to this engine would allow them to operate with in higher temperatures, bringing a weapon load back if it wasn't spent. The company decided that they wanted to impinge the engine onto the national press. And so they said, would I take it to the Farnborough Air Show and do a vertical takeoff with 8,000-pound bombs on it? I said, there's absolutely no way, because we haven't got the thrust. We could do it with 1,000-pounder, but we certainly can't do it with 8. They said, well, we need you to do it with 8. I said, well, why don't you go for something sensible like a world record? And that really was just a one-off throwaway line. They went away and came back and said, you know, we could get the time to height records with this aeroplane. And I said, there's no way. My friend Bernie Scott had done time to height records in a very lightweight Harrier 1. He'd done it in January with an outside air temperature of about 5 degrees centigrade. Bearing in mind the engine loses 100 pounds of thrust every degree, we were in the middle of August and it was 28 degrees outside. But the engineers put it into the model, and the model suggested that we could get 4 time to climb world records. I did a number of practice flights at reduced thrust in the build up to the records, and they proved that the model was pretty good. So British Aerospace got involved. We stripped the airplane down. We took all the pylons off. This was taken on the press day afterwards. The pylons, as you can see, are still on the airplane because we could only get approval to fly without pylons for the record attempt. We then had to put the pylons back on to fly on the test schedule. McDonnell Douglas, British Aerospace, and Rolls-Royce got involved. British Aerospace insisted on having their test pilot involved, so Heinz Frick came along on the day. We all met up in the briefing room, and Heinz Frick, because he was controlling the trial, had the first go. And it was decided he would go for a time to climb, V-style aeroplanes, 30,000 feet. Rolls-Royce said, right, what we need you to do is do a vertical takeoff, accelerate to, I think it was about 400 knots, do a 1.4 G pull, which will get you into a vertical at 15,000 feet, and then cruise on up to 30,000 feet in world record time. British Aerospace said, no, that's absolutely wrong. What you need to do is accelerate to 300 knots, do a 2G pull to 30 degrees, accelerate at 30 degrees to point whatever it was, Mach, and then off you go. And McDonnell Douglas said, no, that's completely wrong. What you need to do is something entirely different. So we had to think about it, and we said, okay, Rolls-Royce have proven their model in the build-up to the day, so we'll go with the Rolls-Royce parameters. So Heinz climbed in the airplane, he got airborne. We watched him accelerate, we watched him pull up, we watched him go into the vertical, we watched him go higher and higher and higher. And then the aircraft suddenly stopped. Well, not suddenly, very slowly stopped in the sky. It tail slid, it flicked, it spun probably 1 or 2 turns, came out of the spin, came down, came back and landed. Heinz looking very black indeed. We got into the briefing room and said, okay, what happened? He said, look, you guys gave me a profile that would get me to 30,000 feet in world record time, but the aircraft fell out of the sky at 27,000 feet. We didn't get there. And the engineer said, that's pretty good. It's within 10% of a world record. No, there we go. So we kicked out all of the engineers, we kicked out all of the companies, and we were left with just, in fact, my chief test pilot boss sat on the door and prevented anybody from coming into the meeting. And myself, Heinz Frick, and a guy called John Taylor, who was the flight test engineer for the engine, sat down and worked out empirically some profiles to do the world records. It was my turn now to have a go. I got in the aircraft, and what we decided to do was use the same profile, but to stop the climb at 30 degrees until I'd got enough speed to pull into the vertical, and then pull into the vertical. And in fact, I got to 30,000 feet in world record time on that. Heinz got in, and I don't know what profile he used, but he managed to get the record to 20,000 feet and 40,000 feet in the same flight. And it was my go for the final flight, the fourth attempt, at 10,000 feet. And I was told if I didn't get 10,000 feet, I could consider myself out of a job. So we thought, well, how are we going to do this? We figured that min drag speed was around 260, 270 knots. So we said, okay, get airborne and accelerate to just below min drag and then pull into the vertical. What G should I use? Well, we figured about 2G should be enough, but if it accelerated, then pull a bit harder. If it slackened off, if it reduced in speed, then slacken off a bit. So I got airborne, accelerated to 260 knots, pulled 2G. The aircraft was going like a train, accelerating like crazy. I pulled a bit harder. I eventually hit 4G, hit the vertical at 320 knots, hit 10,000 feet at 340 knots. So I'd accelerated another 20 knots in the vertical and got the world record to 10,000 feet. My records, this was in August 1989. So what's that, 31 years ago? The records still stand. I've still got the 10 and the 30. Heinz has got the 20. The 40,000 has been beaten by the Russians. So there they are. 3,000 feet in 3,000 meters in 36.38 seconds, 9,000 meters in 81 seconds. I will say that the absolute world records done by the F-15 Eagle, 3,000 meters is he did it in about 18 seconds, and he did 9,000 meters in about 40 seconds, which is half of my time. But they chained down the airplane. The aircraft came back with melted jet pipe petals, whereas the engine on this Harrier afterwards continued with the test program, fully serviceable. And again, this is for VSTOL airplanes, the absolute world records of any airplanes. But as VSTOL records, then they're still good. Where do we go next? I think the smile tells it all, really. This was a photo the day afterwards that appeared in flight. If you want to read the full story of the records, there is a little bit more to it. You'll find it in Harrier Boys 2, the editor of which is Bob Marston, the chap that was with me at Valley back at the beginning of the talk. I'm just going to check the time. How are we doing? 21:23, not too bad. This was my final Harrier. Quite proud to have gone over to NASA to fly a fly-by-wire research airplane at Moffett Field in California at the Ames Research Base. This is the YAV-8B, the prototype Harrier 2. It's got a Harrier 2 wing and a Harrier 1 fuselage. Not many of us have flown it in that configuration, so again, that was a big plus. I flew it on the basis that Northrop Grumman didn't have a Harrier test pilot. Rolls-Royce were into bed with most of the United States companies to make what eventually became the F-35. And most of the US companies required Rolls-Royce's VSTOL experience. Because Northrop didn't have a test pilot, I represented them in the competition program on secondment from Rolls-Royce, and part of that was flying the VSRA, the Vertical System Research Aircraft, this one here, in VSTOL research. It was a fly-by-wire aeroplane, but it was a single seat So the fly-by-wire were controls on top of the throttle and the stick, and you input the two devices, and the controls, the throttle, the stick, and the nozzle lever wound around the cockpit underneath, which you had to monitor. So it became quite a trick. There she is from the front and the side. And there's the boys. Again, the smile tells it all. The chap on the right, Mike Stortz, he was the Marine Corps pilot. He gave me a very nice T-shirt at the end of the trial. Unfortunately, it's very Marine Corps, and it's very Marine Corps pilot, so I can't really wear it in public, which is a great shame. But there we go. That was my last Harrier flight, I have to say, was in that airplane in 1995. Where are we now? Outside of full-time work, around this time, I joined the Harvard team. Spent 4 delightful years traveling the air show circuit with some lovely people. One of whom, I have to say, was Gary Newman, the pop star. He owned the aircraft that's in the foreground. I'm flying it on his behalf in this formation. This is a picture taken by John Dibbs. Dave Southwood's in the Zeke, the other aircraft in the background. Gary at the time had gone on tour in the States. I flew his airplane. I unfortunately damaged it. I did a crosswind landing at Brawdy, which I screwed up, and I scraped the starboard wing on the runway quite badly, I have to say. I was then dreading Gary coming home. I knew each day he was due back, and I phoned him at 5-minute intervals from about 6:30 that morning, and eventually got through at 7:30. I said, "I'm ever so sorry, mate, but I've broken your airplane." He said, "What have you done?" I said, "I scraped the wingtip." He said, "Which one?" I said, "The one on the right." He said, "Oh, that's all right. It'll match the one I did on the left," which I thought was rather nice of him. I have to say, although he got the reputation of being a drug addict and a drunk and so on and so forth, he was one of the most professional private pilots that I ever had the pleasure of flying with. In the time that I knew him, which was probably over about 8 to 10 years, I never once saw him drink alcohol. I never once saw him take drugs. And he didn't smoke either. So, yeah, great guy. Good pilot. I don't like his music very much, but he was very good at flying. Joining Rolls-Royce, I was extremely fortunate to be able to get into this airplane. This was the first Spitfire I flew, the Rolls-Royce Mark 14, which unfortunately met its demise at Woodford in '92, I think, the hands of Dave Moore, when he failed to pull out of a loop, which was very, very sad. For all of us concerned. The company has been rebuilding the aircraft slowly. It's not completed yet, but I suspect at some stage it'll get back into the air again. This aircraft belonged to a chap called David Pennell, GZ Query. He owned it for about 4 years. I flew it for him. It was bought by Jerry Yagan in the States. I taught Jerry to fly it, and then it was sent out there. The question mark on the back, apparently, when the aircraft arrived, the ground crew said, "What letter would you like us to put on the back of the airplane?" And the squadron commander said, "There's a question mark over which flight it's going to." So they painted a question mark on the back, and it became the boss's aircraft for the rest of time, referred to as GZ Query. This was the successor to the Rolls-Royce Spitfire, the Mark 19, that used to belong to the Battle of Britain flight. In formation, we did a fly past at Filton with Eurofighter. A chap called Ian Hartley in there. He got into a lot of trouble for that, because apparently we discovered afterwards that he wasn't really supposed to do a formation with me, but we did. We've not done much modelling, actually, have we? Where are we going to? Right.
Might mean there's another session in there, Andy, then.
It may well do, may well. Right. It's not going to last much longer, but there are a couple more things. This is the Shuttleworth Hurricane. I did a number of first flights at Shuttleworth, and each one of them had its own characteristics, shall we say. The Hurricane was one of the most disappointing airplanes that I flew. I'd flown Spitfire, Bearcat, P-51 and Avenger before I flew the Hurricane. And the Hurricane was supposedly quite a powerful airplane. It's a stable airplane, stable gun platform, very easy to fly, so on and so forth. So on that basis, I took it for its first flight. The aircraft was highly underpowered. Those two words don't go together, really, do they? The aircraft was underpowered and just about got airborne. As I got airborne, I looked down and the temperature was really going off the clock. It was overheating like crazy. I raised the undercarriage, and the undercarriage came half up and stuck in front of the radiator intake, which exacerbated the heating problem. And the aircraft pitched up violently, so I put the nose down and it pitched down violently, and I pulled the stick back and it did the same again. And I was getting very, very close to closing the throttle and crashing the aircraft straight ahead, because it was just about, it was barely flyable, but with everything that was going on, it was totally against what I'd understood to be a Hurricane. Afterwards, we discovered that the center of gravity was about 100% aft of where it should have been, which made the aircraft grossly unstable in pitch. The Hurricane is an unstable airplane. I learned from Bill Pegg, the Brabazon test pilot, at a dinner, that when I asked him about the Hurricane, he looked down his nose at me and he said, everybody knows the Spitfire gets its maneuverability from aerodynamics and the Hurricane gets it from instability. So with a CG within normal limits, it's unstable. So 100% behind the aft limit, it's going to be unstable, which it was. The engineers, they couldn't get hold of the right glycol mix. So instead of putting pure glycol in the radiator, they put a 50% mix of water glycol, and it required 100% glycol to effectively cool the airplane. And as far as the engine goes, the aircraft had got a 840 horsepower at sea level engine, which was less than a Gladiator. A Gladiator has got 870 horsepower, I think, either 870 or 860. The Lysander has got 870, 860. The Hurricane only had 840. It's got 1,000 horsepower, 1,050 horsepower at full throttle height of 11,500 feet. But at sea level, it's only got 840 horsepower. So it is not very powerful for getting off the ground. So for me, it was a very disappointing airplane, although it won the Battle of Britain and the pilots loved it. There we go. Next one, Bristle M1c. I did the first flight of this one after it was built. And my model back in 1987, I didn't know about stability in those days. And I built the tail end too heavy. So I put weight on the nose, and when the model started getting really heavy, I stopped putting weight on the nose. I did a couple of test glides and they seemed fine. So I fired up the motor. It was on Whitley Common in Coventry on Boxing Day 1967. It's a very cold winter high type of day, quite misty. And I set the engine rich, a Frog 150, launched the model, and it did a slow descent to the ground, quite stable. So I fired up the engine again, gave it full power, released the model, and it pitched up into the most glorious wing over. It looked absolutely delightful against the sky, smoke pouring out of the back, pitched up, winged over, pitched down, and hit the deck in a almost vertical dive and totaled it completely. 2 flights. So fast forward now about 30 years, and I'm testing the M1c at Shuttleworth. We've achieved the first flight. Okay, the engine was a little bit iffy to try and keep going, and it remained so for my time at Shuttleworth. Second flight went ahead. At the end of the third flight, the ground crew came up to me and he said, "How'd you get on?" And I said, "Well, it's lasted longer than the model." They just didn't see the joke at all, but I did. There we go. The De Soto. I got an engine failure on the first flight on the approach, which led to me, there was a lot of photographers on the airfield, which I had to aim at the photographers to get them out of the way, which when they realized what I was doing, they ran pretty fast. David Boddington was there. He took this photo. And the reason I mentioned David, or the reason I put it in, was because in the early 2000s, no, this would be the late 90s, I built an Hercules, Keelcraft Hercules, to fly in SAM 35 24-inch competition. And the first year of the competition, I got the model trimmed out beautifully. The night before I gave it a final flight at Old Warden, it caught a thermal and I never saw it again. So I missed the competition. So I built another model. The following year, it was rained off. The following year, it was coincident with the Duxford display, but that didn't matter. I was chief pilot at Shuttleworth. We'd got 3 Shuttleworth airplanes and the Rolls-Royce Spit in the show at Duxford, but I'd got 15 pilots, so bound to find 1 or 2 for the Shuttleworth airplanes, and I'd got a team of 4 of us that used to fly the Rolls-Royce Spitfire. Unfortunately, on the day, I could only find one other pilot, 2 other pilots, sorry, 1 from Shuttleworth and 1 from Rolls-Royce. So myself and the other Shuttleworth guy had to fly the 4 Shuttleworth airplanes, and the Rolls-Royce chap flew the Rolls-Royce Spit, which meant I was stuck at Duxford for 2 days, and I'd missed out on the SAM 35 competition. The aircraft I was flying was the Hind, the Gladiator, the Spitfire, and one other. Can't remember. I think it was either the SE5A or the Bristol Fighter, one of the 2. Quite unique airplanes, but as far as I was concerned, I could fly those airplanes any time of the year. I could fly the Rolls-Royce Spitfire whenever I wanted, but I could only enter my Hercules in the SAM 35 competition on that particular day. I saw David Boddington at Duxford, and he came up to me and I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I've come to photograph." I said, "Why aren't you at Old Warden photographing all the models there?" He said, "I'm going to go there tomorrow. I'm here for today." I said, "You lucky chap, I can't go." And he said, "Why not?" And I explained. And he said, "So you would prefer to be at Old Warden flying your Hercules than here flying these things?" Yeah, I said, "I would, to be honest." So he walked off grinning. And then in his editorial in the next magazine that he wrote, he said that most modelers use their models as a substitute for the full size. Andy Sephton's the only guy I know that does it the other way around. And that, I believe, is just about the end of the story. That's my favorite Shuttleworth airplane, certainly. The Blackburn 1912, I built a number of models of that over the years. All of them fly absolutely beautifully. The full-size airplane flies even better than the models. It's stable around all axes. The engine is a delight to operate. There's more than enough thrust to fly. Very, very simple aircraft to fly. And I think we've just about got to the end. What's next? Oh, no. After leaving Rolls-Royce, I joined Marshall Aerospace, and I've been with Marshalls on and off for nearly 20 years now, mainly off, but a little bit of on, as it were. Flying Hercules. I'm a little bit fatter than I used to be, as you can see. I'm the guy on the left, not the guy on the right. This was a Swedish Mark C130H. This was my favorite Hercules in many ways. It's an aircraft that was in the desert boneyard from 1970 up until when Marshalls picked it up in the early 2000s. The aircraft was stripped down, moved to Marshalls by land and sea, and rebuilt, taken back to bare paint and rebuilt with a glass cockpit and a number of safety modifications for the Royal Netherlands Air Force. I was project pilot, so I did the first flight on the airplane, which is just here. Hold that just for a moment. This is the Royal Air Force C130J, which is a glass cockpit aeroplane with more powerful engines than the early airplanes. You can see the 6 blades on the prop. It's also digitally controlled engines, so they're a lot easier to operate. A crew of 3 rather than a crew of 5, which is in the earlier airplane. This is an XRAF Austrian aircraft that was sold to the Austrians in early 2000s. I flew it both as an RAF aircraft and as an Austrian aircraft. But just to wind a little bit further forward, I noticed that there was a Hercules, model Hercules for sale, an almost ready to fly job, mainly with American markings on. So I thought, well, we'll buy it and I'll decide which markings to put on when I get it. I opened up the box when it arrived, and although most of the markings were United States Air Force Marines and so on, one of the set of the markings was for G988. So 60-inch span, electric, Royal Netherlands Air Force Hercules is sitting in my workshop waiting for its first flight. I've had it since last March, but I haven't been able to fly it because of COVID. And that will be going into flying only light scale as soon as I can get it tested and as soon as we start doing competitions again. But it was rather nice that it was an aircraft that I'd flown. Not only that, it was an aircraft on which I'd done the first flight, which was rather nice. That is the end now. So any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Andy. That was very entertaining. I mean, I've known you for a good number of years now, so know a lot of your experiences, but still I learned even more about what you've done tonight. I think that all of us must be envious of at least one aspect of what you've done, probably multiple aspects of what you've done. But the first two people I'm going to go to for questions, it's because it was these two guys who actually asked me to sign you up for one of these sessions. So we'll go to Paul Rich first, and then to Doug, and then open up to the others for questions. So Paul?
Yeah, I hear it was Doug that stuffed me for this.
Well, I think they're jointly culpable in this one.
Yeah, the terrible twins, Graham. The terrible twins. I know.
Okay. Sorry, Doug. Paul, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I did
Andy.
notice, Graham, that you changed the title of this evening. I'd suggested at the time.
Yeah, well, that was I'll interrupt you, and I'll say that I spoke with Andy on it, and we agreed on this title rather than dig yourself a hole, Doug.
I didn't like it, so we changed it.
Well, I'm not digging a hole, but I'm not allowed to say my suggestions. So
no, you're not.
I'll accept that.
I don't mind if you do. I don't have an issue with it, but I didn't like it. That's all you need to know.
Yeah. Okay. From me, Andy, what I'd like to ask is, with all of your experiences of flying all these different aircraft types, at the end of the day, what is your favourite? What is the one that you really look forward to getting into and flying?
There's three. The Blackburn 1912.
I'm not sure I understand.
Who said that?
I think it's my auto thing
okay,
on my
right.
computer.
Yeah, Blackburn 1912, Spitfire, and Harrier. I don't have the wherewithal to fly any of them now, unfortunately. If I had to choose one, I think it'd have to be the Harrier. But those three have got characteristics. Emotionally, I'm very emotionally attached to those three aeroplanes. Blackburn 1912, Spitfire, and Harrier.
Yeah, great stuff. Blackburn, I think, is lovely. Yeah.
Paul?
Thanks, Graham. I actually posted my question in the chat, Andy, but I'm glad I get the chance to ask it to you face to face or personally. My question is similar to Doug's, but more around a particular type of aircraft. Which was your favourite Mark of Spitfire to fly? Would it be the Mark V Merlin powered Spitfire at Shuttleworth, or the Griffin powered Mark 14 that you flew with Rolls-Royce?
I've flown 7 different marks of Spitfire, and I have to say my favourite is the one I've just flown. They're all absolutely fantastic,
Really?
and they've each got the later marks have got the power, and the early marks have got the handling qualities, and both of them give me the same sort of buzz. So I really don't care as long as it's a Spitfire, you know.
Yeah, fantastic. And a little anecdote for me to you, Andy. I was at, I'm sure it was you that was flying it, but I was at one of the Baggington Air shows in the early 90s when they used to have the Warbird displays there. And I was an ATC cadet standing behind the Spit with my beret on. You fired the engine up, it backfired, flames come out of the exhaust, and my cap went flying up off the field and I had to go and run after it. So a very happy memory, running after my cap. Yeah,
I did do a couple of displays at Coventry.
I'm sure it was you that was flying it.
I spent most of my childhood within a mile or so of Baggington Aerodrome as it was then, but Coventry Airport.
Yeah. So. Fantastic, yeah. But now I did get my cap back, by the way, so it was a happy ending to the story. Thanks ever so much.
Before we go on, can I say a thank you to you, Andy? A thank you that's due back from the days when both you and I were working for Rolls-Royce, and we'd become sort of friends back then. And you used to phone me up when you were about to take the Rolls-Royce Spitfire off to various displays and so on, or perhaps the excuse was just a practice for a display, and you'd phone me up and say, right, Doug, I'm sort of off to so-and-so, and I'm going to do a bit of a practice, and you used to centre your practices around the fairly high chimney of the incinerator opposite the Rolls-Royce offices. So I'd phone a few of my chums in the offices and say, just stand by the windows at 10:15 or whatever it is. And you used to give us a great little display there, centered around the incinerator in Derby for all of, from myself and all of my chums. So a great thank you for that. It was very enjoyable, that.
Yeah, you're welcome. I did the same for Richard Granger, who lives up in that area too. And very interesting one with Bill Dennis. He lived on a farm just north of Hucknall.
Yeah.
And he gave me the coordinates of it. And I said, I'll give you a private display if you'd like one, provided the area is suitable. And it was. So I went up there, had a look round. He said he was there with, I think his daughter and Trish were there. So I went up to the coordinates, saw 3 people on the lawn, and gave them a private Spitfire display. I then called Bill afterwards and said, how was it? And he said, you were miles away. So I don't know who got the display, but it wasn't Bill. And they never complained. So
excellent.
There we go.
And then David Tappan, I think you've got a comment that you made to me a couple of days ago when you asked to sort of join this meeting about Andy and experiences as well, linked with jet judging. Oh, you just need to unmute, David.
Yeah, is that better?
Yep, that's us.
Yeah, I can hardly believe this happened because it's quite a long while ago, but I'll tell the story and then Andy can tell me whether I'm telling the truth. I was involved with getting the English team ready for the Jet World Masters. At that time, you could fly 6 people in the team for the Jet World Masters, and there was such a lot of interest from England that we had 7 or 8 pilots who wanted to fly in it, so we had to have a team trial. And somebody suggested I phoned Andy and I invited him to come and help me judging the team trial. Does this ring a bell at all, Andy?
Was that at Hucknall?
I think it was. Yes, I think it was.
Yeah.
Anyway, the outcome was he showed some enthusiasm until I mentioned what the date was, and he said, "Oh, I've got to bring a Sea Fury back from the States that day." And is that true?
No, I've never flown a Sea Fury, so that wasn't me.
It just goes to show I am 84 years old. So
I did judge a jet competition at Hucknall, and I have to say I was deeply concerned afterwards as to the safety of the jets. There was one chap had a failure and brought the aircraft back towards the crowd, was about to crash into the crowd on the boundary, so he pulled it up, it stalled, flicked, and then it crashed in between the crowd and the stalls, missing everybody by a very small margin. A lot of the jets were flown at high energy towards the crowd, very, very close, and then pulled away. If anything had happened, if anything had broken, if any of them had departed, they would have been into the crowd. So I was deeply concerned at the time, and gave a lecture on jet safety at that year's BMFA AGM. And I was almost drummed out of the BMFA because of it, because of my criticism of jet flying.
How long ago was that, Andy?
That would have been late 90s.
Right. Yes, I think probably things have come.
Yeah.
In competition, we don't even allow any manoeuvres which are towards the crowd.
Yeah.
We used to like to fly a circle, and we always said no, you can't do that, because I was always judging, so I was the nearest to the accident. So we didn't like people doing that, and none of our schedules in the Jet World Master have anything like that in at all. So hopefully,
things have come along a long way. But I have to say that I thought that was the judging that you were going to mention. That was at Hucknall.
I apologise for having misrepresented you.
Not at all. Not at all.
Because I was very impressed with what I'm sure I thought you said, that you were going to be flying single engined back from America. Have you ever done anything like that over the water?
No, I refuse to fly single engine over water.
Well,
although I've flown a Spitfire over the Channel three times. But each time I had an immersion suit, a parachute, and a dinghy strapped to my backside.
Yeah.
I've done it in a Harvard once, and again I had an immersion suit, parachute, and dinghy. But if I ever do it in a twin-engined airplane, I've always got a life jacket on and a dinghy in the back of the aircraft that is accessible.
Well, that sounds very sensible. We got a member of our club who used to work for Piper, and he bought 7 single engine aircraft back from the States. For customers, and he's still alive now. It's amazing.
I don't do that sort of thing.
No.
I have to say, it's in test flying. People say is test flying dangerous, and I just say not if you're doing it properly. And it's doing an adequate risk assessment. And part of the risk assessment process for me is that if the consequences are catastrophic, you've got to take it into account. Whereas on a lot of risk assessments, people say, well, if the probability of occurrence is low, then catastrophic occurrence is acceptable. But for me, it doesn't matter how low the probability is. If the consequences are catastrophic, you've got to take it into account, because one day it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So, and on that basis, I don't fly single engine over water. So,
well, I apologise for
no need to apologise. It's not an issue for me.
Well, it was Graham. I told him the story because I thought it was interesting, and now I know it was a lie. I'm sorry about that, Graham.
It still created good conversation. So, thanks, David.
I'm very concerned because I'm supposed to be doing one of these for you up in March, I think it is, and now nobody's going to believe a word I say.
I wouldn't say that.
I can back you up. David was actually my mentor when I went across to doing Jet World Masters judging. And I remember when we were in Switzerland, you apologised to me, given my experience, that I had to go through all the training. But David has lots of experience in the judging side, and great to see you on this evening.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
I'll go. About to go to John Minshall and a couple of the other questions, but as we have a certain Ian Pallister on here, chairman of the BMFA, who was a retired engineer, correct, in the RAF. Have you got any questions for Andy? Oh, you're still muted, Ian.
Still muted, yeah.
Yes, I heard my name mentioned when Andy was had the picture of the Cranwell Guard of Honour up. That
Yeah.
wasn't me. I don't know whether that was a slip of the tongue or the memory.
Yeah, Ian Harvey is
Yes.
the chap. Sorry, Ian.
I actually auditioned for the Guard of Honour a couple of years later when I was at Cranwell, but I was too short to match the other side. So
We were told that we were all appalling, but we were appalling all in the same way, so we looked good together.
right.
But they never said you were good at anything at Cranwell.
Well, I didn't get there till 74, early 74. But I then followed your footsteps all the way to the Hunter at Broady, and then that's where my flying and I parted company by mutual consent.
That's a shame.
And I spent the next 30 years as an engineer. So
you flew the Gnat?
I flew the Gnat. I was my QFI on the Gnat was Richard Thomas, who went on to, well, he'd just come off the Reds, and then he went back to lead the Reds for another couple of seasons.
Yeah, look, I have to say the Gnat is one of my favourite jets, apart from the Harrier.
My best experience with
it.
that was when I took off on a night flying trip with Rich Thomas in the early evening, when aerobatics was banned on night flying, and we got airborne, and he said, well, I can see a horizon, can you see a horizon? So I said yes, so we went off and did some aeros.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. John Minshall.
Andy, you mentioned earlier very briefly that you'd flown the Avenger.
Yeah.
What was your impression of that aircraft?
Bloody awful.
In what way?
It is a remarkable aeroplane. It was designed to go a long way with a bomb load on single engine, and it did it exceptionally well. Because it had to go a long way, it carried a lot of fuel. And because in order to carry a lot of fuel, they had to cut down quite a lot on airframe weight. So it's not a very strong aeroplane. It's got a very low G limit. And in order to prevent the pilot from overstressing, they made the control forces extremely high. So as a display aeroplane, it's exceptionally difficult to display because maneuvering takes very, very high control forces. For going in a long way in a certain direction, it's quite easy to fly because it's nice and stable. And because the control forces are high, it stays where it is. So for what it's designed to do as a long-range torpedo bomber, it does it exceptionally well. As a display aeroplane, it's not very nice at all. But relatively straightforward aircraft to fly. No major issues with handling or anything like that, except for the high control forces.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John. Colin Leafield.
Oh, thank you.
I saw that, and where are we? This was Woodspring, wasn't it, Colin? Do you want to?
Oh, sorry, I've missed out one. So Chris Armitage first.
Chris
of all.
Armitage, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Go on, Chris. You're on.
Help.
There you are.
Andy, I just want to say big thank you really for the support you gave Woodspring early on in the days we did the show. Because it's thanks to that Woodspring show I got back in the hobby.
That's good. That's a rather nice outcome from it. I was asked to do Spitfire display at the Woodspring show quite early on in their time. And it ended up as an annual thing. And on the back of that, they gave me honorary membership of Woodspring, which I have to say I refused to exercise. I said, look, you've got people that were waiting 3, 4, 5 years to join the club.
Yeah.
And I come along and fly a Spitfire, which is something I love to do. You make me an honorary member. I said, there's no way I'm going to exercise that membership, because it's not very nice for the members that have to wait. And we argued about that, but I never did fly at Woodspring on that basis, because I thought it was wrong that I got the privilege of
You would have
flying
been very welcome, Andy.
I know that, but it just it was just something that I didn't agree with. People getting honorary membership for something that is inappropriate, I thought. But I think I was the first person to land a full-size airplane on your strip with the Hawker Signet, which I brought in one year.
Yeah.
It was flown. I displayed it on the Saturday, and then I think Rob Millenship displayed it on the Sunday, and then flew it out on the Sunday.
Yeah. I think we had an Antonov do a touch and go after that. That was about it.
Yeah. Flying the Signet down was one of my little stories. I'd left home that morning to travel up to. I lived in Bristol at the time. Travelled up to Old Warden. My then partner knew that I was picking up an aeroplane and flying it back. And most of the airplanes that flew in those days were quite fast. So she assumed I'd be back home by mid-afternoon at the absolute latest. There was, of course, a delay and another delay and another delay. The Signet had only got a 2-gallon tank, and it cruised at 50 miles an hour, and there was a headwind. So we stopped off at Finmere and refueled. And then I eventually flew it down to our strip just northeast of Filton, where I kept my Jodelle, and eventually got home via the pub at, I don't know, must have been 9, 10 o'clock that night, to find on my answer phone 20 or 30 panic calls of, why haven't you called? Where are you? You must have crashed. What's going on? Call me, blah. And at the end of that was the first mobile phone that I was told that if I'm going to do that again, I need a mobile phone. So that was the first mobile phone I bought after that particular flight.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thanks to Woodspring. It was a privilege to be an honorary member, but I did decide, and eventually they stopped sending me membership cards. I think my membership lapsed in about 2008.
Okay.
But there we go.
There we go. Colin Leafield.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah. Andy, it's been an absolute privilege tonight listening to you. I could ask you questions all night and you wouldn't thank me for that. But I noted your observations about David Purnell and the Spitfire, because David is sadly no longer with us. He died a few years ago.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. He was managing director at a company called Ryford's in Alder. He's not so far away. And sort of knew him through that. He was quite a lad. And the other one was about Gary Newman and his Zero lookalike Texan Harvard, because I flew for a few years and I used to hire planes at Coventry. There's a guy there called Ron Webster, I don't know if you knew him, but he used to hire planes out, and I went there because he was cheaper than anybody else. And I remember I was there the one day, and Gary Newman had flown in, and I wasn't aware that walked around, and outside the hangar there was parked his Zero Harvard. I thought, blimey, Gary Newman's plane, I wonder if he's around. I sort of carried on walking around and round the corner of the hangar, and there he was having a wee up the side of the hangar. And I thought, well, can't we have a conversation here now? Good morning, Gary, and that was it, But that was how I met Gary Newman. But was his plane one that he sort of modified himself, or was it one of those that was done for the Pearl Harbor film in the USA?
It was standard Harvard, just painted up in Japanese colours. That was all.
It had a single cockpit as well, didn't it?
No, his was twin cockpit.
Was it really?
It was absolutely standard Harvard.
No, just the colour scheme. That was all it was.
It was just the colour scheme. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you met him, would that have been September 1990?
It's got to be somewhere around about then. I was flying
Because
between 85 and the early 90s, you know.
I did an overflight of Coventry Cathedral in the Rolls-Royce Spit in September 1990 to celebrate 50th anniversary of the Battle of Britain.
Right.
And the Coventry Blitz. And I got Gary to do the photographs for the Coventry. Gary flew his Harvard with a Coventry Evening Telegraph photographer in the back because he's one of the few people I could trust to follow the briefing and fly in formation with me.
Right.
So that's possibly why he was up there. Because
he may well have been round about then. He wouldn't have been far off that day. Yeah. Just those comments, Andy. Thank you anyway.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks, Colin. George Kandalikis. Is he still about?
I found it.
There you are, George. I can see you now.
Yes. Okay, I wrote it. I will have to say it out of curiosity because my reasons are known to me. Why did you become so attracted by indoor free flight scale at the time when you first went to your visit? What, you were already a pilot, full-size pilot, radio control pilot? Usually it's the other way around, from free flight to radio control.
I started with free flight, so I've always had a love of free flight models. But the thing that impressed me the most was that indoor scale free flight models fly at a scale speed. And at the time, RC models were racing around the sky at a scale speed of about, well, at least Mach 2, you know. And seeing a tiger moth flying at about 400 knots just did not look right. But an indoor scale model built properly, particularly looking at some of Butch Hadland's models, this was back in the mid-80s, they flew at a scale speed. And that's what appealed to me most, was they look right in the air.
Okay, but no control, no problem with that.
No problem with no control.
Prior control.
No, you don't have to control airplanes. The reason I got back into radio 2005, I was chief pilot at Shuttleworth at the time, and my remit was safety of flight operations at Shuttleworth and safety of the Shuttleworth Collection. Because I was responsible for safe flight on the airfield, I was in charge of the safety of the model club. And I'd looked at the BMFA handbook, and it said that if you fly in front of the general public, it's recommended that you have an A or a B certificate, which is a competency certificate that people get for flying RC airplanes. So I went to the club. I was an honorary member of the club, and I used to fly free flight on the airfield, not radio. I went to the club and I said, have you seen this? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, the club flies on the airfield, the general public go into the car park, therefore you fly in front of the general public, therefore you really ought to have an A or a B certificate. And they looked at me and said, of course we don't. And I said, well, you need to get one. And they said, well, you haven't got one. So 6 months later, I went back with my B certificate and said, now you've got to get yourself an A or a B. And that's why I got back into radio again.
Okay.
Thanks, George. You've got another
Yes, a comment mostly
as well.
I was looking at it a few weeks ago, but I was at home for Christmas and I found it. My very treasured videotape from Interscale 91. And I don't know if you remember it, but there you are also participating with your ABC Robin. A few years younger.
Yeah, I've still got the Robin, actually.
Yes. And I don't know if there is a problem. It's a 30-year-old film. If I'm going to digitize it and upload it as well, I mean, it must have some historical meaning for free flighters, at least.
Yeah.
Just to let you know.
Thank you.
Most definitely. Mike Chilson has just sent his apologies that he's had to sort of sign off early as he's in the US. It's sort of like working time. But the good thing is that Mike is actually going to lead one of these sessions on, I'm going to say February the 27th, which is all about, Mike's the owner of the RC Scale Builder Forum. and it's all about building a sort of positive community for scale modelers around the world. So he'll be doing that session in February the 27th.
Brian,
yeah.
Can I come back on George's comment just a few minutes ago with a bit of history?
Yep. All I'll say is I'll be coming to Dave Oakley afterwards so that Dave knows that I'm about to come to him. On you go, Dog.
While you're doing that, I'm going to fill up my wine glass, so I'll be about 30 seconds.
May I have one last comment? Oh, he's away. Okay, it doesn't matter.
You can say what you really want to say now.
No, George, I was just going to say that that information, that video would be really good. And I think the BMFA could make use of that in their archives as well. But I was going to relate to you and to everybody who has an interest that the interscales that we started back in 1991 actually started from a conversation between myself and a chap who's sadly left us now, called Mike Hetherington. We had our regular Nottingham indoor meetings around that time, the meetings that I organised for quite a number of years. And we made a habit of going to the pub afterwards. And we sat there one evening having a pint or two, back in the days when it wasn't quite so frowned upon to drink and drive, I have to say. And Mike had been over to the US and he'd taken part in a number of meetings over there that were held in Las Vegas and various indoor meetings. And he was full of enthusiasm for the concept of having whole weekends with accommodation and social interaction. He was so enthused with this that we sat there talking and we said, well, why don't we do it in the UK? And at that point, I, because of being the organizer of the Nottingham meetings, contacted the late Doug Shepherd, who was a wonderful chap, you'll remember him, who was actually chairman of the SDC at that time. And we persuaded Doug Shepherd to come up to Nottingham for our next meeting and have a look at the facilities. And the interscales actually grew from that not exactly drunken interchange in the pub, but that's where the concept actually arose. And it's gratifying for me particularly to see that the interscales have actually continued through the years, and really it's now embodied in our Nijmegen meetings that the Dutch guys hold. So that's just a bit of history that you might not be aware of, but it's quite interesting the way that these things develop.
No, I wasn't. I had the pleasure of meeting Doug Shepherd in August '91.
Yeah.
During my first visit in the UK, ever since I was an infant in the late 60s. Yeah. And he told me about it. It was a vintage model day called Warden. I came for the collection, I stayed for the models.
Yeah.
And it was impossible for me to attend at that time because I was to go home.
Yeah.
Anyway, the last comment was, I was building while you were talking. You should forget about writing a book. You should make an audio book. You could spend many, many hours listening to your experiences. Thanks.
No, I also seem to remember that.
To Andy.
Yes.
Thanks.
I seem to remember that Doug Shepherd was a navigator on Lancasters during the war as well.
No, you're absolutely wrong. He was a oh crikey, twin-engined aircraft. What was it? Twin-engine bomber.
Wellington.
Wellington. He did 75 missions as a pilot on Wellingtons during World War II, mainly in Italy.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was a World War II bomber pilot.
Wonderful chap. Yeah.
He is. I flew him up to. We were judging we both lived in Bristol, obviously, and we were judging a competition, a BMFA competition at Hucknall. So I flew him up to we flew from Bristol up to Hucknall, did the competition, and flew back, which saved us a lot of money in accommodation and a lot of money in driving too. So, and I gave him control of I ran a Jodel for 20 years, and I gave him control of the airplane, and he's a very good hand actually. He'd not lost any of his skills as a pilot. Very good.
Yes, we've got a couple of more questions. Martin Kinder's just sort of signed off. Stephen Glass as well. That was his first time on tonight. Another excellent free flight modeler. But I'm going to Adi Hayward, then to John Marr, and then to Roger.
Dave Oakley is before that, actually.
Oh yeah,
and
Dave
I ever flown
Oakley
the
that I
Storch?
forgot about. On you go, Dave.
No, I didn't.
This could be a very short answer then.
I didn't fly the Storch, Dave. I was off sick at the time
Right,
when it was there. When it was ready to fly, I was off sick, and unfortunately, I got the sack before I was able to fly it. I do know Peter Holloway very well, and he did try and persuade me to fly the aeroplane, but by then I was persona non grata at the organisation, so I never got to fly it, unfortunately.
Shame. Sorry about that, but yeah.
It's not an issue. Not an issue. Their problem, not mine.
There we go, Adrian.
Yeah. Hi, Andy. Thanks very much for that talk. It was fantastic.
Yeah, you're welcome.
One thing, the Farnborough incident, my trade was an armourer in the RAF, and we were told about an incident at Farnborough where a guy was doing vital checks on the seat on a Friday afternoon, and they found him in the roof the following working week when they went back in.
Yeah.
So maybe that adds some credence to what happened.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe it was that one. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, I was stationed at Cranwell for some years. What years were you there?
I was there as a graduate entry student from January 73 to January 74. And I went back there as a French student to learn French in January 81 to June 81.
Okay. I was in the middle bit between those.
Oh, okay.
Bank seats there. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that.
Welcome.
Thanks, Adrian. John Marr, another newbie for this evening.
Yeah, I was at the last one, but this is only my second one, so I'm enjoying these very much, and thanks very much, Andy.
You're welcome.
I just wondered, as you can see on the chat, whether you'd actually flown the Anec 2.
Yeah, I flew all the aircraft at Shuttleworth that was serviceable between 1990 and 2009. So the Anec 2 was one of them. I was chief pilot at the time that the Anec 2 was coming up for test. I was flagged to do the first flight, but I let Dodge Bailey do it, and then I did about flight 4 onwards. All of those aeroplanes are underpowered, the Lim Trials airplanes, because of the criteria that they used. Really had them too low power for what the aircraft had to do. But given that, the handling qualities of the aircraft are quite nice. There's nothing benign, nothing nasty about it. It's quite benign handling. It's just lack of power, really. So you just need a bit of patience to get up to height. That's all.
Yeah, it looked to me as though it might be an interesting plane to model.
Well, Derek will help you on that because
he's been very kind.
Yeah, it's a good 3-view actually. I have to say, I've got a copy of it in my archive.
That's right, and I'm sort of busy I'm slowly sketching out, having a look at how to model it, because I'd quite like to try it as my first foray into electric. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, I'm sure Derek can have a few words on that.
Yeah, I was going to come to you, Derek. Have you got any comments?
Yeah, exactly as Andy said about the real one. Mine was underpowered. One day I'll put more power in the thing and give it a a real go. That's about it.
What did you actually power it with, Derek? Because we never discussed
I
that.
didn't say it was a KPO1, had I?
So if you put one of your outrunner, your what do they call them? Yeah.
Yeah, one of the later ones.
Yeah, one of your later KPO ones, the ones that work.
Well,
I mean, the ones that have more power.
It's a brushless outrunner, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. The brushless is what I was. If you put a brushless motor in your KPO one, which you have on some of them, that probably
in my
work quite
airplanes, not in the KPO one.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yes, I do intend doing it, and I think probably it will fly then. But as it was grossly underpowered.
It's certainly the right configuration for a stable aeroplane.
I thought, Andy, you would say it had too thick a wing.
For a model, possibly, but well, yeah, it probably has.
And there's an awful lot of wing for the rest of the airplane.
Well, again, that's not a major issue. If you get the CG forward, put some nose weight on it. Yeah, we got there eventually, didn't we?
Don't go putting John off.
It's either rain with you, Andy, or nose weight, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's a. For those of you who are not aware, if anybody ever came to me and said, "How can I improve the flying qualities of my free flight model?" I always said, "Put more nose weight on it," and 9 times out of 10, it was right. So it's become a bit of my mantra, really. More nose weight.
More nose weight.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Derek. And then the final question will go to our host, Roger.
Hi, Andy. You may have covered this earlier on, so I had to go on to another Zoom. I'm multitasking tonight. How much helicopter flying did you do before you flew a Harrier?
Not very much, actually. Probably about 2 hours, but mainly VSTOL stuff, learning how to hover.
What machine was that in?
There was about 6 of them, I think.
Okay.
Lynx, Wessex, Sea King, Scout, Wasp, and something else. It was what we had at Boscombe at the time.
Right. Okay.
So I learned to fly the Harrier at Boscombe.
Oh, okay.
Cool. I did the ground school at Wittering with the ACU, and then we had a Harrier, a qualified Harrier instructor at Boscombe. They needed an extra pilot for the airplane, so I immediately volunteered.
As you would.
As you would, yeah. And he taught me how to fly the airplane. I did 10 hours of VSTOL and then went up to Wittering for a test, and I was marked as scruffy but safe, which I'm quite proud of after 10 hours of training.
Cool. Thank you. That was all I wanted to know.
Okay, well, that's it. Another Graham, my namesake, is just I echo his thoughts here and say, great talk, fantastic talk, Andy. Lots of positive comments that I've been getting on Messenger and everything throughout the night as well. Really entertaining, and it shows, as you said, you didn't really go through your modelling and everything. So we might sign you up for that at a later date. So thanks once again.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Just to say that in 2 weeks' time, we're going free flight in 2 weeks' time, and it's Peter Fardell that's going to be doing the presentation and showing that Pete wants to show that even although, as he feels, he doesn't have the same skills as like the top guys in then you can still get masses of amount of enjoyment. And I think some of us might disagree with the skills that Pete has, given his latest Blériot that he's done, which looks absolutely incredible. So I'm sure Pete will deliver a very entertaining talk in 2 weeks' time. Final thing just to say is Roger has been working especially hard as normal, and all the backdated sessions are now on the BMFA Scale Zoom YouTube channel. There's just a couple of things we've got to sort with, some of them, but if you go on there, from now on, I'm safe to say, Roger, after the live session, they'll be on within the week after that now?
Yeah, they're going to be, I'm going to make a sterling effort as we're in lockdown to put them on next day, so Andy's will be up tomorrow.
Excellent. And we're getting a lot of sort of like likes and subscribers from that. So thank you, Roger. Thank you, everyone. Final request, just quickly, is the guys from the STC. I've got a couple of nationals things that I need to discuss. So Roger, Doug, Paul, Chris, John, Steve, other John. Not sure who else is on at the moment. If you wouldn't mind just staying on for a second, that would be great. And to the rest of you, I wish you a good evening or a good day if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, and see you in a couple of weeks.
Just before you go, sorry about this.
Yeah,
Eric Trafford, is he still on? You on, Eric?
He was there.
Yes, yeah.
You are. I've got a couple of your fan units already, mate.
I know.
But right hand. So, and I haven't put them in anything, so they might actually go into one of those. I've also got a couple of Derricks, and both Derek and I have been talking about a Sea Vixen.
Yeah.
So in fact, hold the line just a sec.
Yeah, and I've also spoken with you about a profile Jaguar as well, Eric, haven't I?
Yes, we know. Yeah.
This is going to take a couple of ticks, I'm afraid, because I'm going to have to take the video off and take the virtual background off. There we go. Back with you. I've had this uncovered for about 30 years. I built it in 1990, which is the Keelcraft Vixen, but it looks so nice uncovered that I left it as it was. So I might try and squeeze them into that one day.
Well, yeah,
there
never know. Yeah, you might need my latest one, but you've got a bit more poke though.
Sorry?
I say you might need the latest one, but you've got a bit more poke than those early ones. So.
Well, I've got them. We'll have a go. If they don't work, I'll come back to you. But thanks for the offer anyway. For the rest of you, Eric produces some rather nice 3D printed indoor electric bits and pieces. So, yeah. What more can we say, Eric?
Yeah,
you ought to do a talk on that, actually.
Well, I have offered, but you know.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry, Graham, back to you, mate.
No, I've actually just run away to get one of Eric's hops and then one of the little fan units. So
yeah. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.